balancing truth, principles, and perspective. This is the Equalizer Podcast. Welcome to the Equalizer Podcast. Today we're going to talk about the 5D chess being played on the world stage. The board is being reset in real time. Modern wars aren't fought for territory anymore. They're fought for systems. Control the systems and you control the world order. Today we're going to talk about three places that look completely unrelated: Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. But when you zoom out, you realize there are actually three moves on the same geopolitical chessboard. This is actually something I explore in my upcoming book, Invisible War. One of the biggest mistakes analysts make is looking at the world country by country. But modern geopolitical conflict isn't fought that way anymore. It's fought system by system. Energy systems, financial systems, trade systems, information systems, proxy networks. When you understand the systems, you start to see the patterns that most commentators completely miss. And today's episode, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba, is a perfect example of how the board is being reset globally. If you want to understand global power, you have to understand the board. The board consists of five major systems. Energy. Oil, gas, refining capacity, shipping routes. Energy still powers the global economy. Control energy, and you control economic stability. Financial networks. Banking systems. Currency flows. Sanctions evasion networks. This is how countries fund influence and bypass sanctions. Trade routes. Shipping lanes, canals, ports, supply chains. If you control the routes, you control global commerce. Proxy warfare. Militant groups, terror networks, paramilitary actors. Countries increasingly fight through proxies instead of standing armies. Strategic geography. Key regions that give influence over the other four systems. Examples: the Panama Canal, which holds 6% of global trade. The Suez Canal. 30% of global container shipping passes through it. The Strait of Hormuz, we've heard a lot about that. 1/5 of the world's oil moves through it. The South China Sea, where 1/3 of global shipping passes through that region. And the Strait of Malacca, it carries about 25 to 30% of the global energy shipments to Asia. Most geopolitical conflicts today are about reshaping these systems before major wars ever happen. And that's where today's sequence comes in. Move one was Venezuela. Order matters here, and Venezuela had to come first. Why? Because Venezuela controls one of the largest energy prizes on Earth. It holds three classes of critical resources at scale: world-leading oil reserves, major gold deposits, strategic technology minerals. Very few countries have all three. Let's talk a little bit about the oil in Venezuela. You've heard that they have a lot. 303 billion barrels, the largest proven reserves in the world. To give you an example, the U.S. Strategic Reserve is about 1 billion barrels. There's potentially more than 1 trillion barrels in place beyond what we know about. And the important point here, this oil is heavy crude, but that doesn't make it useless. Heavy oil can be upgraded into synthetic crude, producing gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, petrochemical stocks. And petrochemical stocks become plastics, synthetic fibers, industrial chemicals. I'll give you an example analogy. What wheat is to flour and bread, crude oil, heavy crude oil, is to feedstocks and plastics. There is no world as we know it without oil. And those petrochemical stocks that we talked about, that's all those products that he was rattling off there. So it's important that we keep that context in mind. Why is Venezuela important? Yes, oil. It's a big one. But in addition to oil, they have one of the top 10 global reserves in natural gas as well. They also have extra heavy oil, or what's known as bitumen. Think the Orinoco oil on steroids. Massive long-term energy reserves. We're talking 513 billion barrels, maybe more, possibly over 1 trillion in all that really deep stuff. And again, just like heavy crude. It's not ideal for a lot of the things that we want to do, but we can synthesize it and we can make it better for our use cases. Venezuela also has a large strategic coal resource. In addition, precious metals. We talked about those as being one of the key three on our list. The gold deposits are among the largest in Latin America, and the major deposits are in the Orinoco mining arc. They have significant diamond deposits in southeastern Venezuela. And on our list of items was industrial metals, things like iron ore, bauxite, which they use to make aluminum, nickel, copper, zinc, manganese, strategic technology mineral resources like coltan, rare earths that we've been talking a lot about that we need for our cell phones and batteries, mercury, and oh, by the way, lots and lots of uranium. Wonder why Iran likes them so much. So Venezuela is also all about location, location, location. It's why they were chosen by Iran to be a proxy. Venezuela's geography matters. It sits just north of the equator, despite what some of our New York politicians might suggest. With a long Caribbean coast, gives us the following benefits. Oil can move quickly to the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, where we are set up to process heavy crude, the kind of heavy crude that comes from Venezuela. Can also easily make the trip across the Atlantic to Europe and to the growing African markets. It doesn't need to go through the Panama Canal, no Cape of Good Hope trekking, no Suez Canal. It's a straight shot from Venezuela to the African and European coastlines. Let's talk about Iran and Venezuela and their relationship. Hugo Chavez and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad created the Axis of Unity back in the early 2000s. Their motivations for this were opposition to U.S. influence, sanctions cooperation, energy partnerships, and the cooperation included things like energy transfers, banking networks, military technology. Iran gave a lot of military technology to Venezuela, and infrastructure. Venezuela gave Iran proxies, Hezbollah specifically, places to lie their head. The Iranian military cooperation reportedly included drones, missile technology, fast attack boats, and surveillance systems, many of which were transported and transferred to the cartels that run a lot of the Venezuelan government, or did until Maduro was captured. This is the proxy layer. Hezbollah has long operated financial networks in Latin America. Activities allegedly have included things like money laundering, drug trafficking, sanctions evasions, and DEA investigations linked networks through Venezuela and Colombia back to Iran. That made it crucial to lock Venezuela down for three strategic reasons. One, energy leverage. If conflict disrupts Middle East oil through the Strait of Hormuz, Venezuelan oil offsets supply shocks. Two, proxy disruption. Reduce Hezbollah operational networks in the Western Hemisphere, removing the threat of a strike at the homeland that goes beyond the terror cells that are here on the country, which are already starting to see act. And three, financial networks. Cut off Iran's sanction evasion pipeline. A lot of the money, a lot of the oil, a lot of the technology, the things that Iran needed or wanted to get rid of, they could go through Venezuela to distribute it. Move two, Iran. This is where the current operation comes into play. Iran has been a central destabilizing force in the Middle East for decades. Its strategy relies heavily on proxy warfare. Hezbollah, Hamas, the militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. Operation Midnight Hammer Rising Lion, that's Israel's operational name for the action, back in June of 2025, was intended to disrupt the greatest extent possible Iran's uranium enrichment program. And if what I'm hearing is correct, this was a warning to the Iranians ahead of negotiations not to screw with us. Of course, when the Iranians sauntered into the negotiation with the Trump administration and announced that they had enough 60% enriched uranium to create 11 nuclear bombs, the timeline for action shrunk. And as we discussed on the last Equalizer show, you don't enrich uranium beyond about 5% for civilian energy use. Civilian nuclear power typically uses enriched uranium up to about 3 to 5%. Research reactors might reach 20%. Once enriched uranium gets to 60% or more, the timeline to weapons-grade uranium becomes extremely short. We're talking weeks or months, not years. And so Operation Epic Fury had to be launched. Iran has proven that it's not going to stop uranium enrichment or developing nuclear weapons. Not for all the pallets of cash in the world. Move 3. Cuba. Why Cuba last? It's right next door. Isn't it a bigger threat? Well, despite its proximity, it's largely been neutralized already. Compared to Venezuela, resources are modest. There's some nickel, there's some cobalt, some offshore oil potential, but nothing globally dominant. Cuba is contained for 3 reasons. Sanctions. Decades of economic isolation have limited their military capability. Surveillance. Cuba has been heavily monitored since the Cold War. And our U.S. presence. The U.S. maintains a permanent installation at Guantanamo Naval Base. So why do it at all? Well, because Trump's a vacuum cleaner. He's going to clean up the messes that have been made over the last 50 years that he has watched fester and become huge sources of chaos and harm to the American people. Trump is also doing this to send a message to China and Russia. We're not going to put up with it anymore, and you see how quickly we solve problems, don't you? The Trump administration is doing in weeks and months things that have only been talked about for the last decades. And he's showing Russia and China that their weaponry is no match. But it's not just military power that Trump's projecting. It's economic, political, diplomatic, informational, societal, and technological, all at the same time. He's systematically removing the threat that China and Russia have posed for the last 50 years. He's taken their pieces off the board, and he's doing it all at once. By removing Venezuela and Iran from the illicit trade industry and legitimizing them, Trump is forcing China and Russia to play on a global economic field that it can't compete on. He's also limiting their access to massive amounts of energy resources at discount prices that they rely heavily on to compete in the tech race. He's going to make them play the game fairly at the same rates as everybody else. And he's realigning the world centered around Western doctrine. I mean, this is essentially a modern interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, announced by James Monroe. Europe and today rival great powers should not establish strategic control in the Western Hemisphere. More specifically, the Monroe Doctrine said, no new European colonies in the Americas, no European interference with independent countries in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. would view such interference as a hostile act. The U.S. would not interfere in European wars or existing colonies. At the time, the U.S. was not strong enough to enforce this alone, but the British Navy informally backed it because Britain also wanted open trade with the newly independent Latin American states. This doctrine created the idea that the Americas are a distinct strategic sphere. Now, how did it evolve over the years? Well, originally the Monroe Doctrine was mostly a warning, not an enforceable policy, but later presidents expanded on it as our power grew. The Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt declared that the United States could intervene in Latin American countries to stabilize them and prevent European involvement. This effectively turned the doctrine into a justification for U.S. intervention in the Caribbean and Central America. Later, during the Cold War, the doctrine became a justification for blocking Soviet influence in the Americas. For example, the U.S. reaction to the Soviet missile crisis in Cuba, and the U.S. involvement in several Latin American conflicts. Even though this doctrine is over 200 years old, the underlying strategic idea still shapes U.S. thinking, and that's why it's been updated to the Monroe Doctrine, as they call it. The United States still views the Western Hemisphere as an area where hostile great power influence is unacceptable. And that's why the U.S. policymakers pay close attention to things like Russian military activity in Latin America, Chinese infrastructure and intelligence facilities in Latin America, Iranian partnerships in the region. The Monroe Doctrine is really about geography and security. The United States is protected by 2 oceans, allowing hostile powers to establish strong footholds in nearby countries would weaken that strategic advantage. So the doctrine essentially established the Americas should not become a staging ground for rival powers. The Monroe Doctrine declared that the Western Hemisphere was strategically distinct from Europe and should remain free of outside control, colonial, or military. The Monroe Doctrine reaffirms that commitment to the Western Hemisphere on a global scale. Modern conflict isn't just about armies anymore. It's about systems, energy systems, financial systems, trade networks, proxy networks, strategic geography. When you understand the systems, you understand the moves on the chessboard. And when you understand the moves, you start to see the chessboard. Before we wrap today, I want you to zoom out for a second. We talked about Venezuela, we talked about Iran, we talked about Cuba. And on the surface, those look like completely different stories in three completely different parts of the world. But if you step back far enough, you start to see something else entirely. What you're actually watching is the global board being reshaped. Remember the systems we talked about earlier: energy networks, financial networks, trade routes, proxy networks, strategic geography. These are the real levers of power in the modern world, not armies, systems. Venezuela isn't just about a country. It's about energy supply and strategic minerals. Iran isn't just about a country. It's about proxy warfare and nuclear leverage. Cuba isn't just about a country. It's about geography and hemispheric security. When you start seeing the world this way, events stop looking random. You realize there are patterns, moves on a board. Every major power in history has eventually done the same thing. They try to stabilize their home region first. The Romans did it in the Mediterranean, the British did it through global sea lanes, and the United States did it through something called the Monroe Doctrine. What we may be witnessing now is a modern version of that idea, a return to hemispheric security. Lock down the energy, shut down the hostile proxy networks, limit outside powers from gaining influence close to home. Because in the 21st century, the countries that control the systems don't just win wars, they shape the entire world. And that's one of the core ideas that I explore in my upcoming book, that the most important conflicts of our time aren't always the ones that look like wars. They're the quiet battles over systems, networks, and strategic geography. So the next time you hear someone talk about Venezuela or Iran or Cuba, don't just ask what happened. Ask what move was just made on the board.